Hello and welcome to Weird Together. I'm Brennan Storr, host of the Ghost Story Guys podcast.
I'm Joseph Comeau, a tenured sociology professor and host of the Sociology Professor YouTube channel.
And this is the show where we examine the sociological themes behind your new favorite horror movies. We're not critics.
We're not experts.
We're just weird. Together. Joseph, my friend, welcome back. How you been?
I am good. We were talking about this off air. It's summer break. I've got an online class I'm teaching. I've got a few projects I'm doing. But, you know, summer as an academic is this kind of weird time where you have all this extra time to get stuff done. And I just don't get even a third of it done that I set out. Like I spend way too much time doing other things and just being like, oh, you know, I can do it tomorrow, right? Procrastination. And I just get so much more done during the semesters when I'm already busy and pulling what little hair I have out. So, but I'm doing good. How are you, my friend?
Well, I will say I understand that very much because I function much better with a deadline. I am a creature powered by stress, which I am told is a neurodivergent thing. I don't know. I always just thought it was a lazy bastard thing. But either way, yeah, I am at my best when powered by despair and rage in equal measures. Apart from that, though, I'm good. I'm not looking forward to the heat we're about to experience here in Southern Ontario. It is already, as you can see on the video, I'm sweating already because I have to close the windows when we record the show. And the breeze is the only thing I have that approximates air conditioning. And it is going to be warm this week. So I'm not excited for that. I am, however, excited to talk about this month's movie. And that is Paul Owens' Landlocked. IMDb describes Landlocked as summoned to his soon-to-be-demolished childhood home, Mason discovers a video camera that can see into the past, driving him to record as many memories as possible before the doomed house is destroyed. Now, there's a lot to say about Landlocked, Joseph, but before we do that, we have to do that thing we do here on Weird Together, where we acknowledge you never watch a movie in a vacuum. You bring in your expectations, you bring in the day you had, you bring every other movie you've ever seen into that movie theater, or in the case of Landlocked, to your living room. So before we talk about the movie itself, we got to take apart the baggage. All right, Joseph, what, if any, baggage did you have going into Landlocked?
You know, I actually went into this one clean. I knew nothing about it. No baggage. You know, once the film started, I got a sense for, you know, kind of the production level and kind of the feel. It's like, okay, this is definitely a very indie film. Reminds me a little bit of was it Everyone's Going to the World Fair, or We're All Going to the World Fair, in terms of very much done on a shoestring budget and, you know, very much an independent film. So aside from kind of calibrating my expectations based on what they had to work with, I really didn't have anything I went into it with.
Oh, fantastic. To that end, Jane Schonbrun, the director of We're All Going to the World's Fair, their new film, I Saw the TV Glow, is coming to streaming soon. And I hope we get an opportunity to talk about that on this show, because I saw it at Highland Theater about 2 weeks ago, and I loved it. It is a major step up in terms of scope from We're All Going to the World's Fair. So again, hoping to have a chance to talk about that on this show. I'm hoping it hits. Again, I think it's hitting streaming soon. And folks, it is worth checking out. As for me, I was similar. I actually had no baggage going, or very little baggage going into Landlocked. I first watched it in January of last year. I think shortly after it hit VOD. I think it played festivals in 2022. Might even have been 2021. I know 2021 is the listed release date on IMDb, but it didn't become available for everyone until, I think, 2023. And it was one of my random rentals when I was living in Montreal. I just picked it at random, something about the cover. And that's about it. I mean, once I started watching the movie, I recognized, oh boy, there's some themes in here that really hit home. But we'll talk about that more in the talk to go on. So really, yeah, I went in fairly clean and found out that this movie was almost made directly for me, Brennan Storr.
You know, one other thing, it just occurred to me that this film also reminded me of another film we've watched and talked about in the past, Hellbender, because it was a family production, right? You know, small budget. In fact, it probably reminiscent of that even more so than the World's Fair, because of the way it's shot and most of the cast being of the same family.
That's very interesting. Yeah, you're not wrong. I mean, this is entirely a family affair. The cast is made up of Paul Owens' family. Of course, he was a writer, director, editor, all those things. And the home movies featured in the film are, in fact, his family's home movies. And that lends the film, man, some real pathos, some real heaviness. And there's only one place we can talk about these things. It's the only place I'm allowed to say the word pathos, Joseph. They whip me if I do that in the kitchen. The place we can do that is the Toctagon. Welcome to the Toctagon. 2 men enter, 2 men leave. All right, Joseph. So, hit me. Give me some thoughts on Landlocked.
Okay. Really, there's just one really big idea I kind of want to inject in this conversation that it just kept coming back to me as I watched this and as I thought about it later more so. And it's the sociological concept that comes out of the social theory of a dead European theorist, which we sociologists seem to like our dead European theorists, named Emil Durkheim. And it's this concept, the sacred and the profane. And, actually on my YouTube channel, The Sociology Professor, I've got a video that kind of unpacks this, and that'll be in the show description notes of that video. But when I watched this film and saw this home in kind of, disrepair that was going to be torn apart and going through all these things, but then also these home videos and these memories that, kind of took a weird kind of turn in the film, it really reminded me a lot of this concept, the sacred and profane. And like Durkheim's concept, it starts with this very provocative statement that the most important distinction within religion is not good versus evil, but the sacred and the profane. And he argues that religion is not really about identifying good or evil, but it's really identifying those things that are sacred or set apart and those things that are ordinary or profane. There's a whole kind of thing behind this. This sounds like a band name, but roots in this thing called collective effervescence.
I'm pretty sure I saw those guys live back when I was drinking.
Yeah, I think they were opening for 3 Doors Down. But if you've ever been to the way I explain it in my classes, if you've ever been to a concert or a sporting event and you're excited to be there and you're surrounded by people who like the same artist, hence they're at the concert, or they're a fan of the same team, so they're at the sporting event. And that feeling of connection you have when you're in this place surrounded by people who value the same thing you do, they love this band, and they're playing the song that everyone loves, and you're holding hands with people you don't even know, you're giving people, hugs and just really excited and having that kind of peak experience, right? Transcendent experience. That feels really good, right? We love that. And it's a profoundly social experience that is rooted in the sense of connection we have and feeling good when we're surrounded by people who like the same thing we like, right? So that feeling Durkheim called collective effervescence. And he argued, and this is actually the most provocative statement in this whole theory, he argued that religion is the worship of society itself. But what he meant is not that we're actually worshiping society as an idol as much as we're worshiping that social experience. We are worshiping or chasing that collective effervescence experience, right? Because it feels good. So he argues that religion has been created by human societies to create these sort of spaces, these rituals that manifest that feeling. You go to church, you sing a song, you go through whatever rituals you do, connected to other people who are adoring the same kind of deity, doing these same rituals, and you feel that profound connection in that place, right? That euphoria. In Protestant Christianity, they call that the spirit, right? And there's these rituals that kind of drum that up, and then the symbols are those things that remind us of it, right? The crucifix, the menorah, those are elements of religion. So he argues that we create religion to get this feeling, right? And that it's a way to manifest that collective effervescence. So sacred and profane are born out of this. The sacred is anything that's associated with that feeling, right? So those things that are set aside as part of that experience are sacred. So in religion, obviously, they are the religious elements, the symbols and the rituals. But to a sports fan, your team and the place they play or the uniform or whatever, that's sacred, right? The band, those spaces are sacred. And profane is just everything else that's ordinary. So to Durkheim, religion was about identifying those things that are sacred and connected to some sort of sense of collective effervescence. That's a long-winded explanation to set up, though, in this film, you see this rundown house that's going to be demolished. You see all these old things, that they're going through to decide what they want to keep. And to a stranger walking in, or to a viewer watching this film, that is all very profane and ordinary and mundane. It's very, it's just this rundown space. But then you start seeing these videos and this sacredness, right? Home, childhood home, these experiences are being kind of drummed up, even projected into the reality of the moment. So to me, it just kind of this sort of this profane space of this home and all these profane items, video cassettes and whatever else, these moments of sacredness kind of coming out throughout the film.
Interesting. If you sit with that for a minute, it really, I think, says a lot about our place in the world. And it says a lot about how we relate to things and sort of the transitory nature of our relationship with things, because to Mason, who is played by Paul Owens' brother Mason, these items have taken on a sacred nature because they represent something past. When he was among them, when they were a thing that were just there or happening, they were profane because they were pedestrian. But as time has moved on, and he has drifted away from sort of this innocent moment, this time where he was sort of one with, or felt like at one with everything, they have taken on a sacred nature. And it's sort of fascinating because when he passes, they become profane again. It's like the light of consciousness is what lends the experience of the world its beauty and joy. Because if we are not there to experience it, then it merely is. It is neither one thing or another. It requires an observer to create the effect, which sort of puts the lie to the notion of like a single thing can be sacred or profane simply by nature of what it is. But I think we're getting a little further into religious sophistry and away from Landlocked.
Well, let me kind of pick up on what you just said there. There's two things you brought up that I think are really great points, and they're actually part of how I teach this with my intro level classes. We start with this idea, like what we call socially constructed. Like the fact that these things are sacred is not anything inherent to them. There's no a priori sacredness in these items. They, at least not from a sociological perspective. I know some people in their belief systems believe that these things are inherently sacred, and I'm not going to poo-poo on someone's beliefs. Again, from a sociological lens, it's what we call the Thomas theorem. If we believe something to be real, it becomes real in its consequences. These things are sacred because we decide they are, at least from a sociological perspective. So these items and these things are not sacred in and of themselves, but they're sacred when someone steps into the picture who has attached meaning to them that is sacred, right? So these items are not inherently sacred. And when I teach this, one of the things I often do is I show images, just put up in the PowerPoint various places and things and times and spaces, and ask the class, is it sacred or profane? And some things I'll put are obvious. I'll put like a menorah, right? Okay, sacred, right? But I'll juxtapose that with like a candle, kind of decorative autumn candle thing that you'd see on most people's, kitchen, dining room tables. And it's still a candle, but it's then profane, right? It's just an everyday thing, to illustrate that they're neither inherently sacred or profane. But one of the things I often come back to, and it gets to the point you were making at the beginning there, is I will show a picture of a house and I'll say, okay, this house, sacred or profane? And the room is split. A lot of people will say sacred because this idea that home is a sacred space. And I unpack that a little bit and ask, okay, what do you spend most of your time at home doing? Things that are sacred or profane? Like most of the time you're sleeping or eating or doing something boring or whatever. Like they're not doing anything that you would describe as sacred. And most of the time you're at home, you don't feel this sense of sacredness. But when you reflect back on it down the road, right, those memories, and this is what you were talking about, those become sacred. So the daily life at home is very profane, right? It's just doing life. But like the woman who came is knocked on the door. It's like, hey, I grew up at this house. Mind if I kind of walk around? She was having a sacred moment, reminiscing about, living in that house. And one of the big picture ideas here, at least sociological themes here, is that an item not only is neither inherently sacred or profane, but also sacredness is not necessarily permanent with an item or a thing or an idea, right? It can be sacred in one context, but not in another. And that all comes back to it being socially constructed.
Right. Yeah. And it's interesting because the film came about when Paul Owens went back to his family home after being away for some time, and his parents were divorced or had been divorced in the intervening time period. And he started doing exactly what Mason does in the film, which is going through things. Of course, his father's still alive, but he started going through things in the house, and he found it was producing this really strong emotional response. And he was going through the old family videotapes, and he had this sense of longing for the times past, for, what we sort of describe as a simpler time. And one of the other prevalent themes of the film, which really kind of struck home with me, was toxic nostalgia, or the danger of nostalgia. And I think the film does a really effective job of illustrating that journey, because as we watch, he discovers the camera, and he starts realizing what it does, that this camera can see into the past, and becomes obsessive about documenting it. He becomes obsessive about recording the past and trying to preserve it in amber. But eventually he reaches a place where he can see without the camera. He is almost so much a part of the past now that he doesn't need the aid of the camera anymore. And what he sees, he finally sees a memory that's actually quite painful. And, that's sort of the danger of romanticizing the past, is you forget the true nature of it. And I think that's one of the dangers of being able to document the past in that way, being able to see the past in that way, is it is probably not the way you remember it being.
Yeah. And I think there's this, as you talked about that, it reminds me of something I came across in a book when I think it was when I was teaching a sociology of family course many years ago. And I don't even remember the name of the book, but this idea that, as you talk about toxic nostalgia, that, the good old days weren't always so good. And so certainly at a larger macro level and political level, certain political movements that kind of call for hearkening back to a day when things were simpler and better. Things were better for certain people in the past, maybe. And there are other people groups, and obviously, groups on the margins of society, for whom the past was decidedly worse, So there's certainly an issue with that. But there's also this kind of social psychology element to that, where we often look back on the past with these rose-colored glasses, but there's all kinds of distortions to that perception of the past, because one, our brain is kind of maybe cleaning up those memories a little bit for us. Our brain kind of rewrites memories. I remember hearing in a podcast once that every time you remember an event or something, you're actually writing a new memory of that, right? Of that thing, which is interesting. But so our memories are already distorted. That's a starting point. So we're not remembering them exactly as they were, but also think about, as we age, we feel less vital and less healthy. And so like those days when we were young and could run and it didn't hurt our arthritic knees or whatever, and those days when we didn't hurt because we're not old, or whatever, we have a positive feeling about those old, times past because we were younger and more vital. But it reminds me of, I'm going to pull in something from Harry Potter of all places. Okay. One of the most kind of poignant scenes in all of Harry Potter is when Harry is sitting in front of that mirror that shows you what you want to see. And Dumbledore says, basically, to paraphrase, that many people have wasted away sitting in front of this because it shows them a past or something they want to see that they can't have. And there's something about that and obviously he's looking at his parents, right? He's longing for his parents that he never knew. And that's a very poignant moment, but also speaks to this idea of, if we let ourselves get too wrapped up in that past, then it can be debilitating, it can be toxic, and we're in the present and we have the future. That's all we've got. So the past, we shouldn't forget it, obviously, but if we get kind of too hamstrung by that, it can be problematic for how we live today.
Yeah, I think that's sort of a danger of making the past a sacred thing, is because then it becomes difficult to question it. It becomes difficult to face it on its own terms. For example, in the film, Mason, at one point, his brother, Seth, comes to take the dad's old junker car. And Mason uses the camera to see that not only did Seth take the car, but he stole his dad's guitar. And it is something that if he had not known, he never would have thought about it twice. But now he knows that about his brother. And does it add anything to it? Not really. He doesn't know anything more about his brother than he did before. Not because the odds are he probably knew he was that person. But to have it demonstrated for him just brings him additional pain and undercuts the moment that he and his brother had when they left in the truck together. And again, it's that thing where if we look too closely at what came before, when it doesn't conform to our expectations, it can be really damaging. And of course, in the end of the film, Mason is consumed by the past. He follows, again, he is still in the house because the plot of the film, of course, Mason's dad has passed. He sends his sons a message saying, in a week, I'm going to have the house demolished. It's all paid for. You should come and get anything you want if you want to take something. And Mason spends so much time documenting the past, so much time trapped in the past, trying to obsessively catalog it and keep it from going away, that he is still in the house when it's destroyed. And I think that's a really powerful way of demonstrating that again, if we pay too much tribute to the past, if we try to stay too close to it, it will take us down with it, or with it rather.
This reminds me of I'm going to throw one other theory in there. It's kind of social psychology. It's George Herbert Mead's idea of the I and the me. It's sort of the subject-object kind of aspects of our personality. I will not unpack this the same way I did the sacred and profane because it would take a long time, but it kind of gets into this idea of how our identity or our minds are this kind of dialectic between us and society, and the mind is constructed through interactions with society. That's longer aspect of it for my 4,000 level social theory course. But he identifies these two parts of your personality or your identity, your mind, the I and the me. And the I is the subject, the you in the moment, the part of you that's right now acting and responding to things, right? It's the I. It's the active moment. And so that's the, I believe it's the subject version. The me is self as object. It's when you reflect on yourself, right? It's like, if you ask yourself, who is Brennan Storr? What's he about? Why did I do that? Why, I'm sure you ask yourself that frequently.
Every day, several times.
But that part of us that reflects on who we are and thinks about what we did in the past and why we did that and what we want to do in the future, thinking about ourselves as a separate object, right? That is the me. So Mason, when he lived those memories, right, when they were being recorded originally, he was living in the I, right? He was swimming, he was doing all those things, playing, having his first steps, all those things. But as he's watching it back and thinking about him, documenting him, he is then looking at the me he's thinking about. And you could argue, to your point, he's getting a little too trapped in thinking about the me. And you could argue that when a person gets inside their head too much and overanalyzes things, maybe they're getting a little too wrapped up in the me and not living in the I. But that also was something that kind of struck me as I watched this.
Yeah, no, I don't think you're wrong. And I think what you're describing, I think that's especially an issue or poignant, or it's especially true of people in their, I would say, mid to late 20s, because I think you are sort of facing the undeniable truth of the matter is that you're getting older and that your past is now truly in the past. I remember going back to Revelstoke, my hometown, and I think it was actually in my mid-20s at this point, maybe early to mid-20s. But I just remembered that I was sitting in my mother's house. I was actually visiting there with my wife, and I was just suddenly hit by this notion that this isn't my place anymore. And then suddenly I could almost see the way it was when I was a kid. I could see the heavy drapes and I could see the wood paneling. And I realized it was never going to be that again. It can never be that again. And that was really hard, and it hit me out of nowhere. And again, I think it's part of that forcing yourself to acknowledge the fact that time has passed, that you are like everyone else, you're getting older. And I'm sort of hitting this point in my life now as well, because I'm 41. As you mentioned, things don't always work as well as they should. And, I've had one parent die. My father passed about 2 years ago. No, we were not close, and I hadn't spoken to him for almost 20 years. But when I found out he was gone, it still had an effect on me. And part of that effect was that, having your parents alive are almost like, to a certain degree, because we don't see them every day, or I didn't see them every day, you can almost pretend like they're the same age as they were when you were a kid, and it's like a buffer between you and, the fate of your grandparents and the fate of all your elderly aunts and uncles. But as those people go, it's almost like you lose protection against time. And again, I can't imagine if I lost both my parents, or as in the case of the film, we're sort of led to believe they're both gone, and I had to go through the house, I would think I'd be in a similar situation to Mason, because I don't know if I would be able to keep the past at bay. I think that desire to return to immortality, essentially, a time when you never really wrangled with your own mortality, I think would be very strong.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, I'm not going to go into depth of this, but there's a person in my family who, when they lost a parent, it really impacted them. And unfortunately, it impacted their relationships with other people that were important to them or should have been important to them. And, I think it is like, you think about your parents they're old and you're young, and then when you get to be to an age where you're like, oh, well, I remember when my parents were this age. And I've done this mental exercise sometimes, like, okay, I'm a little older than you, 49. I'm like, okay, how old was I when my dad was 49, right? And I'm like, oh man, I remember that. Then the cliche, we become our parents. And, I've got 2 sons and, I have a brother. So I think about, when my brother and I were that age and, and so I'm like, oh man. And it is this thing that it is part of that realizing we're old. But there's also this whole question of how we deal with aging, and the West doesn't do a good job of it. We don't, one of the things they talk about is that, like, there are some cultures where as people age, there are much better defined roles for them in society. Some cultures, elderly populations become, mentors and they're looked to for wisdom. And while we give lip service to that, we really in our cultures in the West here, really kind of cast older populations aside and disparage them. So I think probably there's more of a fear of that aging in our culture because we don't want to be the cast-offs, the set aside, the elderly forgotten.
Oh yeah, and I think that's an outgrowth of our sort of our kind of use once and destroy culture. I mean, I remember when I was younger, I hurt myself at the gym, and reasonably, I hurt my shoulder fairly bad. And a friend of mine was a new friend at the time. She referred to me as broken, and I got really upset about that. I got really upset. She couldn't understand why I was upset. And I told her, I said, because broken things get thrown away. And she said, she was really surprised by that, because she said to her, broken things are mended. But, growing up where I grew up, that was sort of my take on things. If something's broken, well, you don't need it. And I think I grew up in a small town that's fairly emblematic of the zeitgeist. I mean, I think in as much as like it has no connection to the zeitgeist, but it kind of demonstrates those sort of basic middle of the road values. We didn't have any like crippling racism that I'm aware of, but neither did we have any paragons of social virtue. We did not have any wild technology, but we were also not collecting bugs for dinner. Like we were just solidly middle of the road. And I think that solidly middle of the road attitude towards broken things, I think that's fairly accurate. And I think that extends to our thoughts about the elderly.
It's rooted in industrial capitalism and consumerism, right? Like kind of that designed obsolescence, and capitalism needs consumers to consume things. And if something lasts long, then no one's going to buy a new one, right? There's this, I think it's interesting. Malcolm Gladwell has a great podcast and he talks about different things. And there was one where he talked about, there was this, I think it was the Gladwell's podcast. I hope I'm not getting the wrong podcast here. But anyway, there was this one place where there's this old light bulb that's been running in some old firehouse or something that has been running consistently for like over 100 years or something, like just has not broken. And we had the technology and have to make light bulbs that will last, but Then, certainly it's more expensive to do that, but the technology and the industry needs us to buy new light bulbs, right? So we design things to be designed obsolescence, so they become obsolete, so they become broken, so that you need the new iPhone or whatever, the iPhone 27 or whichever hell one they're on now. Because if things last forever, then who's going to buy a new one, right? So there's something to that, and then those ideas, become kind of frames for how we think about interpersonal relationships and ourselves.
Yeah. And I wonder if we have that sort of, because of this is a constant out with the old, in with the new, we hunger for something that is enduring. We need something, we need something sacred. We need something that we can say, this has been and will always be. And I was reading recently The Geography of Nowhere, and he described, ritual as memory plus action, and nostalgia as just memory. And nostalgia was dangerous because there's nothing nourishing in it. You remember a better time, but nothing about why or how, and you don't do anything to engage with that. Whereas ritual, you're actively doing something. It still has a use, whereas nostalgia simply has no use.
No, I like that because, for example, and the ritual can be something very just mundane and simple. Like, think about a family holiday tradition. Right. That every Christmas Eve you do this thing because when you were kids, they did that. Now, just remembering that thing and, longing for it can kind of be sad, but making it something you do every year because you did it is this tradition is life bringing, right? It's something that you appreciate and enjoy. So that's really a fascinating idea. And I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and I think it translates to the film really well because, as we see, Mason has very little relationship with his brothers. On the night that he gets there, his brother turns up and they talk. They share a joint outside on the deck. They talk a little bit about their lives. And then the next morning, his brother's just gone. He just, without even saying goodbye, he just leaves. And you see that he has almost no relationship with Seth either. And Seth, his other brother, doesn't appear to want a relationship. And in fact, he discovers that Seth lied about the circumstances of his father's death, that his father did not die right away, but that it was a process, and he was denied access to that process. And so he has this nostalgia for this time, and they all kind of pay lip service to this notion of being together, but they do nothing to actually make it happen. So it's empty. And I think that's where the danger comes in, because longing has no end. And longing is like a current. And if you're not careful, it will tire you out and eventually drag you under the waves.
It comes back to the mirror that I talked about, like that mirror in the Harry Potter thing, right? He was longing and just sat there, and you could waste away with longing. Whereas if you act on it, even if it's, hey, let's every year meet at the same place that Dad loved and have dinner at his favorite place, right? That action has you get together and you connect and you and have, share memories about Dad instead of just being longing for him. That's more healthy and productive.
Yeah. Our relationships are what we invest into them. And again, I think that's something we do just as people now. I think that we have this tendency to talk about relationships and talk about wanting connection, but then we say, well, we don't have time. Yeah, and while certainly, we are expected to work ever more and for ever less reward, but I also think there is time for things, but we use that time incorrectly quite often. The time we do have, do we put that time into towards sort of nourishing the things which nourish us, relationships, interests, or do we look at our phone and just scroll through social media feeds? And certainly there's an amount of biology at work there. I mean, dopamine reward is a very real thing, but I think also there is something to this notion that, well, I don't have time. Well, you do. You're choosing to spend it on the easy thing as opposed to the hard thing. And the hard thing is to make time in your schedule to talk to someone. I know I have a friend I love very much. We keep saying, oh, we got to talk. And we have not done it in months. And when we do talk, we love it. We'll spend 6-7 hours on the phone sometimes. But we just, one or both of us will have to cancel for whatever reason. And then it's just lip service. And all lip service does is create distance between you. And again, I think like Landlocked is a great portrayal of that distance. because it seems like Mason hasn't even really invested much in his own future. When he's talking about work with his brother, he's just sort of describing dissatisfaction. And there's nothing, every positive thing seems to be in the house and the memories in the house. And, I think one of the reasons, and you and I were talking about this off air, actually, we were talking about the film Tomorrowland and this notion that we have to invest in a positive future. We have to, and like emotionally invest and psychologically invest, not just financially, but we have to like look and plan for a future and want something better and move to, and actually make steps to do something, even if it's something small. And what we see in the film is that Mason isn't really doing that. He's just investing in the past because it's easier, it's there, and the past doesn't really require anything from you. At first, you don't, again, it doesn't take effort to go, whereas it takes effort to do the ritual. It takes effort to, again, to just make a positive step forward. And again, I think like the film is lo-fi, but I think it wrangles with those themes really well.
Yeah, I think so. And, first watching the film, to be honest, it was slow. Didn't really grab me in the way some other films did. But as you start thinking about these themes, you realize, okay, this is more of a deeper, slow burn, right? There's these feelings that these sort of things that are definitely much more what this film is about, and those family relationships. And I think this is one you have to sit with after you watch it to really kind of really appreciate that. Yeah,
I agree. And I just want to sort of give some praise to the cast, because again, the whole film is just, what's his name? I've lost his name already. Paul Owens' family. And his trade now is mostly as a sort of a documentarian. So this was, he doesn't have a lot of experience working with actors, but I actually thought he managed to pull pretty good performances out of his family. And he said it was actually really cathartic in a lot of ways to shoot the film. He said that they actually found themselves getting emotional at times because he realized their characters were saying things that they had never said. And that really connected for him in a lot of ways, connected for all of them. And he said stuff that he thought might actually be sort of flippant, might actually be very serious, like his father's death scene, or the scene on his deathbed. He said they were actually cracking up. He said those were, for some reason, they had this like very, very funny reaction to that. But there were other things that sort of hit home more. And I think you feel it, right? Like you feel that through the film. And again, I think it's, as you say, it's lo-fi. I've seen it 3 times now. The first time I saw it, I was like, yeah, I like that. And some stuff really kind of hooked me. But when I watched it twice for the show, the second time especially, there's some stuff that just really, I don't know, I felt really pulled to it. And again, I think it was really very strong. And what I think is interesting too, there's some symbolism in the film that he won't discuss, or he has declined to discuss in interviews, specifically the symbolism of the insects. And I'm curious to know if you have a take on that or any thoughts off the top of your head.
I was just thinking about that and wondering, because there are 3 insects, right? Grasshopper, a wasp, and a bee, I think. Is that what they were? So, I mean, the first thing that comes to me, obviously, is those were represent the 3 siblings. So the question is, what are they? Certainly maybe one, you think of a bee as a productive kind of contributor to society, right? Then you think of a wasp as something that's a little more out for itself and a little more dangerous, and maybe a grasshopper eats crops, I don't know, and is a nuisance. So I just wonder if that has something to do with the 3 brothers. Maybe certainly the one brother who I think was Paul, the writer, I think, the one with the glasses. I feel like that was Paul. I wonder if he seems to have a job or a career. So maybe he's the worker bee, and maybe the brother who steals the guitar is the wasp, and the brother who's kind of just goes around and maybe the grasshopper's a little bit of a freeloader mentality, just grazes on crops, is Mason. That's the top of my head what comes to me. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's compelling. I mean, I think the wasp, because the wasps turn up a couple times. We see that really the only thing that's thriving in the house when Mason first arrives are the wasps. They have a set up camp, I think, like above a door or something, or in a corner of the house. So they're the only thing that's thriving. And it does seem like in that space, it seems like Seth is the one who stayed. And he seems to be, to whatever degree, he seems to be the one who's succeeding in that space, who's able to stay behind, because there are some people who can do that. There are some people who can stay behind where they are and make it work. and other people have to go. And this is true of small towns, it's true of cities. I know people who grew up in New York City, but had to leave because it wasn't their place, whereas some people grow up in Sheboygan or, Lake Okeechobee, and their only thought is, I must get out. I must get to a city, so and that becomes, I think, the sort of the standard narrative, but I think it can go either way. And, so I think it could be very well be. And I think Mason too, if Mason is the grasshopper, he does seem to have some problems kind of finding a place to land. Like he seems like the kind of person who would go from place to place to place because he has not, as I say, he spends time, his time is looking backwards. He's talking about his art job and how, we have to, he works for an artist and he's talking about, artists, man, I can't hang, it's been hours and I couldn't hang the picture right. And I think, well, that says more about you than it does about the artist.
So he's going where the sustenance is, like a grasshopper, just going, and not necessarily like whereas a bee has a plan and is doing a thing that's productive, and a wasp has a place it stays and it hunts, maybe less productive or less contributing than a bee does with its pollination. The grasshopper is just going to wherever it can find food, basically.
Yeah, I think you might be onto something, and that would explain why he was reluctant to explore it in interviews.
Doesn't want to make those commentaries on his siblings.
Yeah, I think that would probably be unwelcome. That's going to do it for our thoughts on Paul Owens' Landlocked. That's a recommend from me, folks. How about you, Joseph?
Yeah, I think I would, for someone who's into film, obviously indie film and film with kind of deeper themes. If you're looking, if your tastes are very saccharine and you like kind of the, big budget films that are very, the narrative is handed to you, then you're not going to enjoy this. But if you like digging into kind of these deeper themes, I would recommend the film.
I mean, I would argue that applies to almost every film we do on this show.
Right. I think that's fair.
All right. Yes. So that's a recommend from both of us. Landlocked is streaming now on Shudder in North America. You can also, I believe, still watch it on Tubi, or if you don't have either of those services, you can rent it on VOD. And folks, remember, we always say this on the show, please do not pirate independent films. Every dollar you spend on independent film is a vote for more of that same thing. It says to distributors, we want this, there's an appetite for this, please keep financing and making these things, because if we don't do that, there is no outward indication and no financial incentive for distributors to continue sourcing and releasing these films. So again, if you're going to pirate something, which we don't recommend you do it to Marvel, do it to Disney, do it to the people who can afford it. Do not pirate independent films. And again, it's a couple bucks out of your monthly budget, and you're giving it to a good cause, and you're getting some great entertainment in return, and some food for thought too. All right, my friend, where can everyone find you online?
Well, you can find me on Twitter at JOKOMO13, JOKOMO13, and you can find me on YouTube at The Sociology Professor.
Fantastic. I'm Larger the Truth on Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, and Letterboxd. You can find my other show, the Ghost Story Guys podcast, everywhere fine podcasts live. All music on this show is composed and performed by Elliot Wilder of The Revenants. Find more from him at therevenants1.bandcamp.com. Our theme song is Rest in Peace, also by The Revenants, from their album Music from Big Beige. Thanks as always for joining us, folks. Until next time, remember, we're weird.
And you're weird.
So why not be weird together?